under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseWare continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseWare at ocw.mit.edu.
The other item that I auctioned off, that's a good question. Well, first of all, before I tell you that, you'll note that I put those two packages up here in the front of the room for this first section. One was bigger than the other, and you guys got the smaller one, right? And you obviously know what that was. The bigger one turns out to have been a book. In fact, it's a book that I recently published on hedge funds. Now, it turns out that the bidding of that second item went for $60. The bidding of the item that I sold to this section went for $45. And the fact that it's a smaller package, I think makes some sense of why it went for a smaller amount. That shows you the power of information or lack of information in terms of determining values. Yeah, question? Well, I don't think so, and one of the reasons that I had two different packages, and I showed both of you, this entire section, the two different packages, is to try to eliminate a bit of that kind of private information. I don't believe there was any. If I used the same two items, then I think there would have been a concern that there might have been some information spillover. So I don't think that was it. In fact, I think what it was the size of the packages, believe it or not. So anybody that tells you that size doesn't matter, I think is not being realistic. Was another question back here? Okay, yeah. The book retails for $45. Now, of course, I autographed the book, so that probably reduced the resale value, right? But. And, we played, I took the $60, no tears. Fair is fair. So this class, the individual who bid $45 for that iPod did very, very well indeed. And the student who bid $60 for the book didn't do quite as well. But that's the point of this example. It's that when you don't know what you're bidding for, when there's literally no information, you're obviously not going to get it exactly right. But you have to admit that in the grand scheme of things, it's actually not that far off, and not that far off in a very particular way. I want to, in particular, talk about the iPod, because we were looking at something like a 70% discount off of the retail value of that for this class. Now, I want to comment on that in the context of what's going on today, because I want to spend a few minutes before we start the lecture talking about current events, because finance, of course, involves current events. And right now, we are going through an extraordinarily interesting set of times. I think that's a Chinese curse, right? May you live in interesting times. Well, we're going through some really extraordinary times, because what happened over the weekend is something that has probably not happened since the Great Depression. What happened over the weekend is that the federal government took over two of the largest government-sponsored financial entities in the world, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. These are two government-sponsored entities. They're private organizations, but they have the backing of the government in some ambiguous sense. And it was ambiguous up until this weekend, what that meant. What happened was that these large financial institutions were responsible for purchasing the mortgages from various different regional banks and lending institutions. But why would they do that? What was their function? Anybody know? Yeah.
To provide a secondary market for mortgages so that the banks that are the initial lenders can generate more mortgages and make credit more available.
Exactly. Their goal was to really make credit more available in the housing market and the student loan market and the auto loan market, these consumer finance markets. The purpose of these two organizations was to buy up the various different obligations from banks and other financial institutions so that the banks and financial institutions could then go out and lend more money to more individuals that wanted these kinds of loans. So the purpose of these two organizations was really to support and grow these various markets. And it turns out that over the last 20 years, these markets have grown to epic proportions, tremendous proportions. And now, as the housing market has turned down, the original lenders that made these obligations are facing some severe pressures, and that's carried the ripple effects all the way through the financial system to the point where these two organizations literally could not stand on their own. And if there had been a default of these two organizations, there would be some major repercussions. We're going to talk about that in about 4 lectures. The material that we're going to develop over the next 3 lectures are going to allow us to analyze the situation and really try to understand what's going on in these markets. But I just wanted to alert you to the fact that something really big has happened. You won't understand fully what it is. You might read the newspapers, and I would encourage you to do so, but you won't fully appreciate the importance of it for another 3 or 4 lectures. But you're going to see this event unfold before your very eyes this semester, and that will provide the motivation for developing the tools to understand what's going on. Yeah?
Can I ask you now, or can we ask you now?
Sure.
What do you think that was their only option, Paulson's only option, or do you think that was the right?
Well, that's a very tough question. In terms of the possibilities for the Secretary of the Treasury, Paulson, and the government, there aren't too many left in the sense that these two organizations are in a real bind in that they have issued lots of securities based upon their activities. And in order to maintain the quality of those securities, in order to make good on those promises that it has made to other counterparties, very important counterparties, I might add, including the governments of India, China, and a number of sovereign wealth funds that we depend on to loan us the money that has kept us in the style to which we have become accustomed in this country. In order for us to maintain those kinds of relationships, we have to make good on our promises. And it's getting harder and harder for these two organizations to do so because while they've got all of these promises that they've made, the money that's supposed to be coming in order to allow them to make good on these promises is dwindling. And as they've tried to raise more money in the open market, it's become harder and harder because people realize that they're in trouble and it's very difficult for them to raise that money. In fact, this is related exactly to the point about the iPod auction that we engaged in last time. Think about how little I received for that $150 item. I received basically 30 cents on the dollar. And why? It's because none of you knew what was in that package. So now, instead of an iPod that's in a wrapped package, imagine if that wrapped package contained paper issued by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac. And now, I'm going to ask you, can you bid on this paper? Now, I don't know whether Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae will still be around in 2 years, but I'd like you to bid on this paper anyway. And by the way, what you get for this piece of paper, I don't really know. So it's wrapped up, and you don't know either. You don't know, I don't know, you know I don't know, and I know you know I don't know. So what's that piece of paper going to go for? Well, probably less than 30 cents on the dollar, right? So what we saw happen in this classroom last time is exactly what's happened in spades to these two large organizations. At some point, there has to be a day of reckoning, and the Treasury decided, rather than waiting for that day of reckoning, because if that day of reckoning came before they were able to do something, it's very hard to put the pieces back together. So, in my opinion, I think they had very little choice but to do something right now before it got out of hand. And we're going to talk about this again. In fact, we're going to run a trading game where all of you are going to get a chance to engage in this kind of trading. It's not exactly the kind that involves credit, but it'll be a trading game where you'll get to see what it's like to be under pressure and to have to make decisions and value securities in real time. And you'll have a much deeper appreciation for the kind of issues that we're up against. Yeah?
Sorry, what did the government exactly do? Just agree to pay for all their...
Right. Yes. So the government said, okay, you guys, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, you can't make good on your obligations because you've got some problems. So we, the Treasury, will stand by all of your claims.
Did the government pay that?
Absolutely. You know how? How can the government pay that? What?
No, issue the money?
You can issue treasuries or
Exactly. The government, they own the printing presses. So they just, you want to get paid dollars? I'll pay you dollars. Here, how many dollars would you like? I'm going to run it. Here you go.
So we'll probably see an increase in inflation.
That's the concern. So the concern is that if you do this too much, and you do it without anything backing up the pieces of paper you now print and give to your debtors, then there'll be a problem, because pretty soon they're going to realize that the piece of paper isn't really worth as much as they thought it was. So inflation could be a problem. It could be a problem. We'll have to see. But right now, the paper, the dollars that are being printed are backed by the full faith and credit of the US government, and for the time being, that still means something. Yeah.
Are all the levels of debt being guaranteed? Or is it just how much is the Fannie and Freddie issued debt?
Right, so the question is all of the debt being guaranteed, or is it just how much Freddie and Fannie issued? Well, certainly it's what they've issued. So all of the paper that they've issued will be backed by the government. In addition, there's some new paper that they have to issue in order to finance additional mortgages, and the government will back that too. Now, this is not for free. It's not just printing presses. That sounds a little too easy. Somebody has to pay for it. The money's got to come from somewhere. Or put it another way, that money that is spent now backing these instruments cannot be used for other things. So if you believe in balancing your budget as opposed to spending on credit, which frankly is what got us into the problems to begin with, then there will be additional reckoning. People have said that the American taxpayer will pay for this. Well, that's true, but the question is, which set of taxpayers? Is it us? Is it your children? Is it your children's children? There are a lot of intergenerational questions about where the burden lies. But the fact of the matter is, yes, we are on the hook, that the American taxpayer is on the hook for tens of billions of dollars. Now, in the grand scheme of things, tens of billions of dollars is nothing. I mean, the federal budget is much, much larger than that. So this is not a big deal. The concern is if this spreads and ends up costing us more because of ripple effects and knock-on effects that we don't yet know about, that could be a problem. And that, frankly, is one of the reasons why the Fed and the Treasury decided to step in now to try to contain this problem. How good they will be at doing that, we don't know. Read the newspapers over the next few weeks and let's see.
Do you think the common stock is basically has to be worth zero at this point now?
Well, it's not worth exactly zero, but it's pretty darn close. And in fact, it's come down quite a lot. I think over the last couple of years, I don't know what the peak of the price was. I haven't looked at it, but I think that the decline has been on the order of 90 to 95% decline of what the peak was over the last couple of years, which is 83%. 83% since when? Yeah, that was just a day ago. But I'm talking about since the peak, I think it's come down dramatically. So effectively, the value of the shareholders' equity is pretty close to zero. But that's what happens in a bankruptcy. And by the way, we're going to talk about bankruptcy too. That's going to be a very important part of what we do when we analyze fixed income instruments. So we're going to get to that shortly. Yeah.
Has there been anything about someone potentially going private again down the road? Is that
There have been discussions about them going private, but private in a much smaller way. So the discussions that have occurred at the Treasury, and we don't know which way things are going to end up because it's a political process as well as an economic one, but there's a feeling that these two institutions got too big too quickly and that there wasn't enough oversight to allow them to be able to fail. In other words, they grew so big so quickly that after a point, they were in fact too big to fail. And when you're too big to fail, all sorts of abuses and improper risk management practices can go on, which we will talk about in probably 8 or 9 lectures, okay? So there's a variety of proposals that have been put forward, and we'll talk about those also over the next 6 or 7 weeks.
Who did the government actually bought the shares from? Are they federal agencies or is it private companies? Who?
So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are called GSEs, government-sponsored entities, which means that they're not a federal agency, but they are backed by the federal government in some manner that has been up until now relatively vague. So they're meant to be private companies. They had a CEO, both of them had CEOs who were fired over the weekend. They have separate boards of directors, and they pay pretty attractive salaries, private sector salaries. But they were related to the government in the sense that their objectives were to try to support and expand the housing market financing, which was a government-dictated mandate to this.
Their main goal is not to earn money, it's to bring a secondary market for mortgages?
Their main goal was to create additional financing to allow the mortgage market to grow and to allow people to buy homes at reasonable rates. Their secondary goal was to make a profit on top of that. So that's why they're not just a government entity, but they have a kind of a quasi-private sector type of mandate. And by the way, they did a great job. They did a great job in the sense that the housing market has grown tremendously. Now, you could argue that that was irresponsible and that created all these problems that we're facing today, but you talk to somebody who has a subprime mortgage that otherwise couldn't have afforded a house, that now has made every single payment and really enjoys living in their home and has a lifestyle that they couldn't have otherwise had. You talk to them and you tell them that it was a mistake. So it's not at all clear that this is a total disaster. It's unfortunate and it's a catastrophe from the point of view of the current holders of various pieces of paper that are related to these subprime mortgages. But there's a whole group of people out there that have benefited from these subprime mortgages. And so you've got to balance the costs and the benefits. And we're not doing that right now. Right now, we're just panicking because we're all scared like hell that something really is going to break. But there's a positive side as well as a negative side to every story. And so we're going to have to talk about that in a little bit more detail. But we can't do that unless we have the framework to think about it. So that is going to lead me to today's lecture. Yeah. So there are two groups of individuals that are involved. One are the shareholders of the companies themselves. And these are investors. A number of them are pension funds, institutional investors. So therefore, you and I, in our 401k plans, we might actually have an investment in one of these organizations through the plan sponsor that invests in various different entities. So like they're a stock that was traded on the exchanges just like any other stock. That's one group. And those are going to lose most of their capital. They're going to lose their investment. Just like when a stock goes belly up, the investors of Enron, too bad, they lose everything, they're gone. They knew it, they took the risks, and the risks don't always work out, so that's that. The other parties that are involved are the folks that do business with these agencies, the counterparties that bought the paper that they issued, these IOUs and other complex instruments that Freddie Mae and Freddie Mac issued. Those individuals we're hoping will be relatively happy about the outcome of the government backing the paper, because now the paper that they once held and thought was in trouble will have the full faith and credit of the U.S. government behind them. And that is a major concern, because these counterparties are very, very substantial investors. If they decide that this paper is no good and they start getting rid of it wholesale, that will create some really significant market dislocation and mass panic. And that's what the Treasury stepped in to stave off this weekend. And hopefully, they will have succeeded. In fact, if you look at the data, it looks like they did succeed, but I'm not going to talk about that for another 3 or 4 lectures, because I want to show you exactly how to think about these instruments, and then we're going to look at the data and see whether or not they've actually done something significant. And you'll be able to tell by looking at market prices, by looking at the outcome of auctions like we did last time. We're going to be able to tell exactly what happened. Okay? All right, well, that took a little longer than I thought, but I think it's useful for motivation for what we're going to do in the class. What I want to do today is to start on lectures 2 and 3, present value relations. And I have to tell you, this is one of the most interesting lectures of the entire course, not because of the underlying material, but rather because of the novelty of the perspective that I want to give you about these kinds of issues. This is the very first step in changing the way you look at financial transactions. We're going to start by discussing cash flows and assets. I want to define some terms, and I want to change the way you think of an asset. And then we're going to talk about the present value operator. And then we're going to apply that to the time value of money. I want to make that concrete so that all of you will start thinking differently now about money today versus money next year. And then, probably not today, but next time, we're going to cover two very special kinds of cash flows, the annuity and the perpetuity. These are two mathematical abstractions that provide some really interesting insights into this whole notion of present value. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of technical issues, compounding and inflation, and that will lead us right to thinking about fixed income securities and how to value them and how the market values them and whether or not the two are the same or different. For the readings, I'd like you to start on Brealey and Myers-Allen, chapters 2 and 3. You should have already read chapter 2 from last time. I'd like you to reread that and also focus on chapter 3 for the next couple of lectures. Okay? So, first order of business, let's define some terms. I think you all know what a cash flow is, right? It's just money that's coming to you or going away from you, a flow of cash. And you all know what cash is, I presume. The next question I want to take on is, what is an asset? You know, we talk about valuing assets, but we have to start first by agreeing on a definition for what an asset is. And I just put some examples up here of what assets are. Business entity is an asset. If you guys decide to do a startup, that startup has value. It's an asset. Property, plant and equipment, patents, R&D, stocks, bonds, options, and even something as difficult to value as knowledge and reputation are assets. Does anybody know of an example of a really valuable asset that is not physical at all? You can't touch it or feel it. Yeah. The algorithms that Google is using, that's right. Now, how do you know that those are assets? They generate revenue, right? And has anybody turned them into anything concrete, like any type of legal structure to make them assets? A patent, exactly. A patent, and Google has many patents, those have value. Not only are they considered assets, but you can actually trade them. You can buy a patent, sell a patent, license a patent. Yeah?
Are they patents or are they trade secrets?
Well, they're both. So Google has patents, but there are also a number of trade secrets that it uses to protect its intellectual property. What's a distinction? Yeah?
No, it doesn't have any patents.
No.
What does that mean?
What is a trade secret? It's a secret. Thank you. Well, I'm not sure it's a patent without any kind of legal standing. In fact, it's sort of an anti-patent, isn't it?
It's not a patent, it's a secret specifically. Like Coke, for example, the formula for Coke is a trade secret. It is not patent. When you apply for a patent, you have to disclose fully what your patent covers, and that means that at the end of the patent's life coverage, or at the end of the life coverage, you're out. And so I could go and, if Coke would have applied for a patent, however many years ago, would have expired, I could be making Coke right now. But a trade secret is secret forever, as long as you take steps to keep it secret.
Right.
So they are taking the risk of the secret.
Exactly. Coke is taking a big risk in that it has not filed for a patent, and frankly, if it did, it would have expired long ago. Now, what exactly is a patent? What's the motivation for a patent? A patent is a legal agreement that says that if you tell me everything there is to know about how to construct the item or algorithm that you want to patent, if you're willing to disclose that to me and the whole world, and I acknowledge that it is new and useful, then I will grant you the ability to be the sole user of that algorithm, product, or business process for a finite period of time, say 17 years. So for 17 years, if anybody wants to use that algorithm, they have to pay you for that privilege. So it's a monopoly. It's a monopoly that the government grants you for a fixed period of time in exchange for what? in exchange for you to be willing to disclose everything there is to know about it. And why is it? So that everybody else can learn from it. And after 17 years, and after you've made a god-awful amount of money, somebody else can take that idea and incorporate it into what they're doing and make money off of that. The patent process creates assets out of ideas, and it allows you to derive economic value from that in exchange for freely sharing those ideas. That's one path to go. The other path is I don't want to share because I think that I can do better by keeping it a secret, and that's what Coca-Cola has done. That's the example that I was thinking of an idea that has no legal standing, but that's one of the most incredibly valuable ideas in the world today. The amount of money that Coca-Cola produces is unbelievable, given this simple recipe that apparently people haven't been able to figure out how to reproduce. I mean, how hard could it be? You know, you just mix a few things and add some coloring, and you know, then you get Pepsi. I don't know. Yeah.
A lot of their value is also in the brand.
That's right.
Billions of people who associate a red dot with feeling happy.
That's true. Now, that's the case. They've spent years building the Coca-Cola brand. That's one of the most recognizable brands in the world. And that has value too. And by the way, that value is different from the trade secret. So now we see that there's lots of different assets. And that's an asset, right? Yeah.
Is there a financial reason, or maybe not, for why you would patent something versus something that's a secret? And what I was thinking of was pharmaceutical companies, right?
Yeah.
Why would you go and patent medicine first? Wouldn't it be better for you to keep it a safe and be the only company in the world ever to do so?
Well, that depends. It depends on whether or not you think you can keep it a secret. Right? Coca-Cola apparently has been kept secret pretty well, but there are a lot of other people working on the various different kinds of cholesterol-reducing drugs, not just you know, the folks that develop Lipitor. So if you can keep it a secret, great, keep it for yourself, but very often you won't be, because other people are working on the same research. Also, there's a certain cachet to having a patent, and it provides you with a certain kind of business viability. You can go to an investor and say, here, I've got this idea. The idea has been certified by the US Patent Office. It is patent number XYZ, and that's why you should give me money. Versus, you go to an investor and say, hey, I got a secret. I can't tell you what it is. You know what? You're back to the iPod, okay? Andy, question?
Oh, no, I was gonna say the same thing.
Yeah, okay. So now we know that there are all sorts of assets, even intangibles, even things that you can't hold in your hand can be an asset. I want you to forget about all of that. I want you to think about an asset in a completely different way. I want to reduce an asset to its fundamental core properties. And to do that, here's my definition of an asset. An asset, at a given point in time, T, is simply equal to a sequence of future cash flows. CFT, CFT plus 1, CFT plus 2, ... That is the definition of an asset that I would like to adopt for the next 12 weeks, okay? Now, this might seem trivial to you, but trust me, it's not. It's a very subtle idea. And it's going to have all sorts of interesting implications that we're going to discuss over the next few lectures. But I want to make sure that everybody fully appreciates what I mean when I say an asset is a sequence of current and future cash flows. Let me just describe a couple of interesting things about this definition. First of all, it doesn't involve past cash flows. So when I define an asset, I have to define it relative to a point in time. That in and of itself, I think, is something new, right? So it's not enough to say an asset is Coca-Cola. You have to say that the asset is Coca-Cola today versus Coca-Cola 10 years ago versus Coca-Cola 100 years from now. Those are different assets. The point in time actually matters, in other words, right? This is like the Zen paradox. You can never step into the same river twice, right? Because water's moving. It's always a different river. In that sense, an asset, at every point in time, is a different asset. And that's not that surprising, because if you believe, from my definition, that an asset is equivalent to its current and future cash flows, then those cash flows are very different depending on where you stand. So for example, the stock of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac as an asset was very different 5 years ago than it is today. They're both assets, they're both cash flows, but the cash flows are very different depending on what point in time you're talking about. So when I think about a cash flow, I'm thinking about a particular sequence that occurs given market conditions. And an asset is comprised of those cash flows. They are one and the same. When you tell me that you have an asset, I immediately think of, okay, what's the sequence of cash flows? That's all I care about. From the purposes of financial analysis, that's all that matters, okay? So over the next few weeks, we're going to be building up a theory of financial analysis. The basic building blocks of that theory are assets. So you could think of assets as the molecules or atoms of a unified field theory of finance. And the protons and electrons, those are the cash flows, okay? Yeah.
Do the cash flows have to be positive?
No. Nope, they don't have to be positive or negative, but they do have to be real numbers. So no complex numbers here, okay? Positive or negative, that's what an asset is. Now, you might think, well, gee, if all the cash flows are negative, then I don't really want that asset. Well, that's the nature of an asset. Maybe then you call it, instead of an asset, you call it a liability, exactly. But from my perspective, developing this atomic theory of finance, I'm going to focus on this as the basic building blocks. I don't care whether they're positive or negative for the moment, okay? We're going to talk about their characteristics later, but I just want to agree on the definition of what an asset is. Question? Yeah.
So it's a sequence of cash flows, it's not a summation?
It's right. It's not a summation. It's a sequence, meaning it's basically just a list of cash flows at different points in the future, including the present, but not the past. So according to my definition, the past doesn't matter. When you talk to me about an asset, all I'm looking at is current and future cash flows, okay? And it's a sequence of cash flows, so that means they're ordered in time. And I'm not even telling you whether or not you know what the cash flows are. So it could be that the future cash flows, I'm writing them as letters, but who knows what the letters stand for? You might not know what the future cash flows are, but you can still nevertheless acknowledge that they exist as an abstraction. Okay? That's what an asset is. I don't care what you use to value your various different cash flows, but the definition of an asset is simply a sequence of current and future cash flows. All right? That's what we're going to talk about as an asset. So all the things that I listed up there, knowledge, reputation. Can reputation be considered a sequence of future cash flows? Does that make sense? How? What? Goodwill. How would you use that goodwill? Yeah.
Your reputation is such that people choose you instead of a competitor, and so that additional cash flow from that choice is coming from reputation.
Exactly right. The additional cash flow that you get based on that reputation, that's the value of the asset, or that is the asset right there.
Yeah. Assets have common elements?
Absolutely. No reason why you can't have common cash flows across different assets, right? But nevertheless, a single asset is a collection of present and future cash flows. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I can explain correctly, but as you said, like if I have one asset for building, and if she has a building, and if I'm a lender, that means like I have a different cash flow on this asset.
Yes.
But however, there's a market value of the building.
Yeah.
So what, if it's like it's a sequence of cash flow,
Yep.
okay, how can you do it?
We're going to get to that. That's actually a very deep question that will require 3 more lectures before we get to. But I will answer that exact question in 3 lectures, if not before. Okay? Before we talk about how to value these assets, I want to make sure we agree on what a definition of an asset is. So I think we agree, right? Any questions about that? Yeah.
Okay, so you have a bunch of atoms, but they can't generate
Well, not to be anal about this, but mathematically, a sequence of 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 is a bona fide cash flow, right? So the 0 asset is possible too, all right? So this is absolutely general. And you might argue at this level of generality it's useless. Well, not quite, because I think it helps us to formulate a perspective. And the perspective is when you start thinking about various different kinds of assets, I'm talking really complicated assets with all sorts of options and triggers and various contingencies. The more complicated it gets, the more important this framework is, because no matter how intimidating the problem you are faced with, the bottom line is an asset is a sequence of cash flows. It's simple, conceptually. The hard part is figuring out what those cash flows are. But the conceptual framework is what I want you to start with, because that will clear your mind of a lot of cobwebs that really don't belong in any kind of financial analysis. So we start cash flows. Sequence of cash flows is an asset. Okay. Now that I've told you that, there's lots of examples that you can come up with. So I've given you some in the notes. Please take a look at them. Each one of these is an asset. And each one of these represents a certain sequence of cash flows. Some may be more subtle than others, but they are nevertheless cash flows. So I want you to think about that, read through these examples, and make sure you understand why they are assets. Now, valuing an asset, that's the question that Young-Hun was asking about. How do you value a sequence of cash flows? Because you and I, we might have a very different perspective on what that cash flow is worth. So for the moment, I'm not going to answer that question. Or rather, I'm going to answer it with a typical device that economists use all the time, which is I'm going to just create some notation to answer the question. And the notation I'm going to give you is V, in particular V sub t. That's a function that takes as its input a sequence of cash flows and spits out a number, which I'm going to call the value of the asset at time t. So how do you value a cash flow? Well, you use the value operator V sub t. You stick in a cash flow, and out pops a number, okay? We're going to have to spend the next 3 lectures figuring out what V is. But I can tell you one answer right away. In fact, all of you know what V is, or one definition of V. What is it? Can anybody tell me what V is? Where do you get V from? Yeah. That's right, but you're close. Where did that come from, what you pay for it? What do you mean by that? Market price. What market? What market? Yeah. Exactly, any market. This is what you were getting at. What you pay for it, any market. If there's a market, you've got your V. So V, one example of a VT is a market at time t, right? That's what we did last time. We had a value operator. Stick in a gift-wrapped box and you get out $45. That's an example of V. What we're going to try to do, though, is to take apart that box and see how it works and whether or not it does work.
Would it be any market or the markets that generate the best cash flow?
Well, we don't know what best means. So for our discussion right now, any market will do, but then you can have a separate discussion as to whether or not there are better markets or worse markets, and we have to define what that means. So we're going to get to that when we start talking about how the V operators work. Yeah. So we don't know what a perfect or an imperfect market is yet, and I'm going to hold off on that for quite a few more weeks. All we know is it's a market. So let me put it to you this way. In the last lecture, when I auctioned off that iPod and I only got 1/3 of the price, would you consider that a perfect market? It didn't feel that way to me. But on the other hand, it worked. I had something that I wanted to unload, and I unloaded it at a price that 2 mutually consenting adults agreed to. So, that worked. It was pretty good. But in order for us to understand whether or not it really works, we've actually got to take apart the box. We've got to open up VT. I'm not going to do that just yet. I want to first acknowledge that there exist VTs out there, and more often than not, when you let the market dictate what that VT is, you actually get some pretty interesting results. Results that will require a little bit more structure to interpret. One way to interpret the structure is to acknowledge that there's a time element to the cash flows. So when I ask you to analyze a VT or an asset, the first thing you're going to want to do is to draw this picture right here. And I'm serious about this. In order for you to understand the value of an asset, you have to know the timing of the cash flows. Time means everything in finance, okay? A cash flow today is not the same as a cash flow next year. Yeah.
So are we going to divorce the accounting definition of an asset from finance? For instance, land, right, has to be recorded at book value at all times.
Yes.
In accounting.
Right. So what I'm asking you to do is to think abstractly in terms of the cash flows themselves. I haven't talked about accounting practices at all. I'm going to come back to how we actually implement this, and at that point it'll be important to bring in the accounting elements. But for now, let's set them aside, okay? So these are actual cash flows that you will receive at different points in time. And by the way, I want you to use this exact same framework for analyzing accounting practices, because financial analysis can actually be used to ask the question,